Hello everybody and welcome back. So what we're going to be doing now is looking at a really useful application of Python within Houdini, and that is to create shelf tools. Because often what we do is we want to create a script that we can trigger again and again, and particularly if it's something very useful and that we find that we use recursively across projects. Then you want access to that. You don't want to have to code it every time, and you certainly don't want to have to save your script somewhere else and then just pull it into your Python source editor every time you want to run it. It's much easier to just have it stored as a button. You just click the button and something happens. So obviously this is for things that you're going to be using again and again. There is a reason we do that sort of Python on the go type stuff when it's just a once-off. You have to think a little bit differently when it comes to shelf tools or anything that is going to be recursive, because you need to sort of think in the long term and how it would be applied across different projects, different situations. You often have to build a lot more kind of error checking in it, or a lot more interaction with the user so that the user knows exactly how to use the tool. For example, if you want it to run on, maybe do something to a bunch of selected nodes, like change their color or whatever. If the user has no nodes selected at all, or maybe they have the wrong type of nodes selected, you need to be able to actually filter for this and tell your user that, or print an error in sort of a useful way. Because you can't rely on the fact that, oh, well, you know what the script is doing, because then it's not a very good shelf tool. You yourself will use it later on and probably forget what the script is doing, or you'll hand it to someone else and it kind of they don't understand how the tool is structured, so they don't know that they need certain things selected in order for it to work. So you kind of need to start thinking, if you're going to make a shelf tool, you need to think a lot more kind of user friendly, and you almost have to kind of apply one of the sort of principles of coding. And I know that sounds a bit strange, but basically you need to pretend like your user is an absolute idiot. It's not to insult anyone, but honestly, the thing is, even if I build this tool for myself and then in a month's time I click that button, see, I'm not going to think about what that tool is actually designed to do or what's happening in the back end of it. And I may accidentally use it in the wrong way. So you really have to make it foolproof with error checks and type checks and all that kind of stuff. All right. Now, something else that makes shelf tools a bit interesting is that you need to sort of ask the user a lot of questions, essentially. Some of them are easy as just sort of clicking one button and it just does one thing, and that's quite obvious. But some of them you want a little bit more interaction. And so I'm going to show you one way that we can feed additional information into a shelf tool, as well as then applying what we learned in the who.ui module, where we can kind of pop up and ask questions. And of course, if things get very complicated and you build a really intense tool that does lots of cool things, then you may want to even employ sort of a PyQt and actually have your own custom UI pop up with a bunch of settings and things. Okay, so let's take a look at how to create a shelf tool, and then we'll sort of talk about how to interact with it correctly. So you can create shelves in Houdini just by clicking this plus over here and say new shelf, right? There are obviously some shelves that already come with it, and you can add to these if you absolutely want to, but the best thing would be to create your own one. Now, I've specifically created a shelf here for this Rebel Way course so that I can install all of the things in here that I've designed for this, and we can keep adding to this if we want to. So you can go and create a new shelf if you want, and think very carefully about where you store it. Remember, we created that global location where we were storing scripts and stuff. We haven't done anything there yet, but we will. It would be cool to actually go and store your new shelf in that location, because it kind of makes a lot more sense. Or alternatively, you store it in the default location where it wants to install new shelves, but you give it an actual specific name rather than just the sort of default shelf. Okay, so I'm going to go and delete this one over here because that was just an example. But here, this Rebel Way one, if I go and edit it, you'll see that it is in the default location, but it is called specifically Rebelway. Okay, so the shelf itself is just an empty container for tools, right? You then within this shelf can say new tool. Now this is where it gets a little bit confusing. It's not complicated, but a lot of the time people forget it, including even when you've done it a million times. It's so quick, it's so easy to forget this part. When you create a new tool, it does not automatically create it on the shelf that you right-clicked on and said create new tool. Okay, I don't know why. Hopefully they fix this at some point, but at this current point in time, you see, even though it has literally created the tool on the shelf here, its save location for the tool itself is saved into the default shelf. Okay, and what we need to do is change this to point to the actual Rebelway shelf itself, and then say accept. And now when we apply this tool, all of its data is stored in that one shelf, because otherwise it's like the button lives on this shelf, but then technically the script is saved on another shelf. And so if you wanted to maybe move this shelf to a new machine, or give it to your friend or something like that, then you hand them the shelf, they've got a bunch of buttons, and they click them and all of the scripts break because none of the scripts have been moved with it. Okay, so now obviously we're going to be applying to external scripts, so we're not really going to use much in the script section except to trigger an offsite script, but anything in here will then be stored in whichever shelf you've stored it in. Okay, and so that's why we want to make sure that you kind of go and, like I always do it whenever I'm going to create a new shelf, is go to the shelf here, copy the actual path to where the shelf is, and then when I create a new tool I can just paste it in here and make sure that it is definitely stored in the same shelf. Okay, very annoying that has to be done, but you know, there we are. Alright, so once you make a new tool, you can give your tool a name, which you absolutely should every time. Don't just call it tool 1, tool 2, or whatever. Just actually give it something useful. You know, maybe at first when you're just experimenting, you just give it some sort of default name, but then you really have to try and remember later on to go back and give it something useful. Because if you want to maybe trigger that remotely, or just even remember what it is or what it's doing, it's really good to have a name and a label. Okay. So for now, I'll just leave it at default because we're just going to do a quick test. Okay. You can also go and set an icon for it if you want, so that you know they're like this. You know, actually nice, useful icons. So it's quite a fun part of designing the script at the end, is going through all the icons and picking one that matches what it does. And then the script tab, this is the most important part of it. This is essentially what where we're going to run our script. So when we click the button, it executes this script. Now, if we do external scripts, we will then this will be a reference to something external. But for now, we can just type anything in here and it'll run. And you can choose a script language, so you can run HScript buttons, but by default, it's actually set to Python because it knows that you're most likely going to use Python in the shelf tools. Then you can type up a help file, right? And I think you can just type whatever you want, but there is actually, I believe, in the help browser, there's actually some documentation on how to format this correctly. But this will basically just be like, I think if you hover over, then that'll explain what the tool does. So this tool does some cool stuff, right? So then when we apply, I think if we hover over, no, you don't see it there. All right, maybe it has to be a certain format, but anyway, most of the time I haven't really needed to do this, because if you name your tools correctly, you kind of know what it does. But it's actually that's probably bad and probably lazy. I should actually go, and in this help section, you should actually really, type what the script is actually doing, okay? Because there's a good chance that you're going to forget what it does, especially if it's referencing an external script. Then you have to go hunt down that external script and go and check and read through it all just to remember what it's doing, as opposed to just leaving a nice, useful help for yourself or for whoever uses the tool. All right, so then here you can specify which contexts it's available in, and so, so you can limit it only to OBJ or SOP level or whatever, and then you can edit the hotkeys as well. So if you want this tool to be called by an actual hotkey, then you can go and edit and add it to that. All right, so that's all there really is to shelf tools. But now that it's here, if we run this tool, right? I mean, we can go and put anything in here. We can just say import who, and then say print hello, and then say accept. So now when we click it, it just prints hello. Okay, it's really, really simple. But there is something additional that allows us to kind of get some more information from the user and sort of decide how the user wants to use this tool. Particularly, I use it when I want multiple modes for one tool, because you don't want to necessarily have like 3 different actual buttons on your shelf that trigger a similar call, but just with maybe slight variations. So what I often do, the main context I use it in is when with a script, you sometimes want to have a sort of a simple version of the script where it asks fewer questions or maybe no questions. It just makes a bunch of assumptions and does the quick version of the script. Then you want the normal version, and then you might want the sort of forced long version where even certain things where it's going to make assumptions for you, it will instead ask. Basically, it's similar to, you know how you can do like a quick save, like auto save, or then you can have save and then save as. So save is just going to immediately save over, but save as will then ask you to choose a file and specifically specify the name and click OK. So it's that kind of thing where you've got a quick version and then a long version and then the normal one in the middle, right? So I often use it that way, but you can use this in whatever way you want. Now, how we sort of embed these multiple scripts into one is the fact that when the user clicks the button, depending on whether they've clicked Control, Shift, Alt, there's all sorts of things that they can possibly be doing, including combinations of that, like Control, Shift, and click the tool will do something different to if you just Control click. You know, like if you're creating a camera or a light, for example, as well. If you click camera, you literally are going to choose where to place it. But if you Control click the camera, we now jump straight into the camera, and it goes from our current view. That's kind of what I'm referring to here, and we can do that in our own tools as well. So how this works is basically when you run the shelf tool, because of the context, it has a dictionary attached to that call. So when you click it, the actual callback of clicking the button has embedded in it a dictionary. And that dictionary is called kwargs. Okay. Now kwargs, I did explain this before, but it's keyword arguments. It's kind of a word that is often used to refer to keyword arguments. So in coding, you'll come across the fact that whenever there's a dictionary of keyword arguments, they call it kwargs. Even though you can give it a custom name, it's sort of the known practice to always call it kwargs, because then if anybody else looks at your code, they don't have to guess what actually that is or know what your custom variable name means. They automatically understand, oh, this is kwargs. Okay, it's a bunch of keyword arguments, right? It's the same as args is used for normal arguments. Keyword arguments are kwargs, and then also how temp variables that are used for nothing but testing and are never applied at the end are called foo. These are just sort of conventions within coding. Okay, and so Houdini has done exactly that and called the dictionary kwargs. Okay. So what we can do is if we print kwargs, and because it is stored literally as a variable, it's as though we've gone, with any other variable, we go x equals 2, and then when we say print, we just print x. Well, it's exactly the same. It's just that we're not defining kwargs. It's defined by the pressing of the button. Okay. So if we now say import who and then print kwargs, what's going to happen now is when we click this button, it prints the dictionary that is stored in that variable. Okay. Now, in fact, let's let's be a little smarter here and go from pprint import pprint, and then let's pretty print the quarks, just because it's nicer to read in one line. Well, yeah, one per line like this. Okay. So this is the dictionary that we get when we run the shelf tool. Now we'll see later on as well with certain other callback scripts, there are also quarks included. So this is not exclusive to shelf tools, but it is also not in everything as well. Like with parameters or whatever, they don't have a quarks because it's running every time it cooks. Whereas on the shelf tools, when you click it, it creates the quarks dictionary for that particular callback. Now you'll see it has a bunch of keywords with values. Right, and these values can then be used inside of our script so we know what happened at the time of that button being pressed. Okay, so alt click, for example, is false. And it's false because when I clicked the button, I just left clicked. If I now go and hold alt and click on the new tool, right, prints the exact same dictionary, but you'll see the value here is true instead of false. So it knows what I was pressing when I clicked on it. Okay. Now, there's even some of these, which I think they've even added recently, because there's like autoplace I haven't even seen before. But you know, you can actually sort of experiment with what these are, or try to maybe search in the help file for a list of what they are. But some of them are quite obvious. I mean, alt click, for example, is quite easy. Command click and control click. Command obviously for if you're on Apple. And then shift click as well. So those are some really useful ones. Also, tool name can be very useful, because sometimes what you can do is, even on your tools, they all have an automatic sort of pre-built script in them, which just calls an external script of the same name as the tool. And so all you need to do is have the tool name correct, and then it references your external script automatically. And you could do that using this. Okay, or you could print, you want to maybe tell people when they've clicked on something, oh, you've just run tool 1, and this is what's happened. And then also, so you can get the pane name. So remember with the who.ui, the actual pane and that type of stuff. Then we've got output index and inputs and stuff like that. So a lot of these I think are not really relevant when it comes to a shelf tool, because we don't have inputs and outputs, so it's probably why it's a -1. But then when we run on HDAs, you'll see it will print probably a similar dictionary, except that on an HDA, because when you click that button, it also has a callback. It'll also have quarks, except that will now have a list of inputs and outputs and stuff like that. Okay. So primarily, we're going to use this just for the Control, Alt, and Shift clicking. And if you really need multiple, you could combine them. So Control Shift click the tool will do something different to if you just Control click. See, I Control Shifted, so Shift is true, Control is true, but Alt and Command are false, right? What you'd probably do, because Command and Control are it's Apple and Windows, you would just go and check both of these and do an OR function. So because I can't command click if I'm on Windows, and I can't control click if I'm on Apple, so you can just kind of do an OR, and so if either one of those are true, then you count it as the same function. And then you can also look at your Alt and look at your Shift and sort of say, oh, well, if they did Shift click and Alt click, then do the following script. If it was Shift and Control, then do something else. And that's how you can basically build multiple functionality into the tool, as well as then obviously coding it with some questions, things like who.ui.read input or whatever, and then you'd essentially ask them enter a number, and now you'd be able to sort of so if this button is, let's say, doing something like caching a frame range or something, then you click that, and then they'd be able to say, oh, well, between 5 and 30 or whatever, and then you click OK, and that's just going to now return some information inside of here. We would need to take 5 to 30, extract that, convert that to figure out what range, and then run our script based on that. Okay, So that's kind of the idea that behind shelf tools, is building these kind of useful user functions. Right. So in the next lesson, what we're going to do is I want to talk, we're not going to directly refer to shelf tools in the next lesson, because we want to cover a very specific module that I've spoken about before. I've said we need to cover, because the example I want to show you with the shelf tool requires us to create parameters. And so what we're going to be doing in the next lesson is covering the who.parm template module, which is quite an in-depth module. So we're probably going to take another 2 lessons even. I'll probably split it up because there's a lot of information. We're going to cover that intensively, because then after that we're going to do an example of a useful shelf tool to build. But that shelf tool relies on creating parameters on nodes. Okay, so we're going to combine the who.parm template module with what we've just learned about shelf tools into something pretty useful. Okay, so that's what we're going to work on next, and I'll see you all in the next lesson.